told me in the student survey I sent out that you know somebody with a neurodevelopmental disorder, and I listed those as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and dyspraxia. And yet, very few of you knew a lot of information about the disorders that some of your friends and family have. These are some fairly new disorders, and so with this with the newness and novelty of them, there comes a lot of preconceived notions. There's 11.5 million people affected by both ADHD and autism, and yet they're still not understood. So to bring in the history, the first known case of autism, without actually saying autism, was in 1911 by a German psychologist named Julian Buehler, and he used that to describe schizophrenic thinking. It didn't become autism as we know it today until the 1960s. ADHD, on the other hand, was talked about by Klaus W. Lang. He says that in 1789, a Scottish psychologist by the name of Sir Alex Chitron, he used it to describe a case without actually using the term ADHD. This was only brought into the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, in 1968. To define these disorders, I spoke to my good friend Emmett Acker, who has Asperger's syndrome and ADHD. To describe autism, he said, it's a learning disorder that's on a spectrum. It's hard for us people with autism to understand social cues and communicate. He also said that ADHD is almost the exact opposite of autism, where you talk too much and you have a hard time with your control and attention. Due to these definitions, a lot of stereotypes come about. Some of them are very harmful, and some of them are more what you would perceive as positive. A big stereotype is that ADHD and autism are the same. This is obviously not true. Rosalie Mansour, who has a PhD in psychology and behavior, says that ASD and ADHD co-occur at high rates, and they're at clinically significant rates. The levels of symptoms between autism and ADHD co-occurring can range from 28% to 87%. This shows that although they co-occur at both high and low rates. Another bad stereotype is that autistic people can't feel empathy. I spoke to Emmett Acker about this as well because this is something that he feels very strongly about. He says, this is one of the worst stereotypes I've ever heard. Lower end people on the autistic spectrum have low empathy. This is true. But high functioning people can often feel empathy, just not the same way that non-autistic people can. And the third and final stereotype that I'll talk about is one that is portrayed in media very prevalent today, especially because of shows like The Good Doctor. The stereotype is that all autistic people are savants. Savants are people who know a lot about one topic, and that is like their special thing. They're like super good at it. Think of people who are really good at math, or like in The Good Doctor, where Sean Murphy is really good at being a doctor. Terrell Teffer acknowledges this stereotype, but also disproves it. He says that 50% of the savants in the world are autistic, but only 1% of autistic people are savants. These stereotypes can also contribute to ableism. Ableism is a distaste towards disabled people. There are two types that are easily defined. There's the casual version, which I spoke with Emmett Acker about again, and he says, people think that because he is autistic, he can't perform at the same level that his non-autistic peers can. And they either consider him inadequate or too high functioning to do tasks. And most people who are not autistic see these things as not an issue, or they see it as something that just happens. Kristen Giuseppe Lynch also portrays this fact by saying that university students who have negative connotations with autistic people just simply have no education, and they tend to be men. And this is a graph showing the percentage of men who have a distaste toward autistic people, and if they're going into a helping major, which is like nursing, which I found very surprising since they're supposed to be people who are very forgiving and very kind. And now violent ableism is where it's purposely done to harm disabled people, like refusing them a job so that they can't make money, or the very obvious things like bullying, violence, and abuse. Their symptoms, causes, and treatments are also a big thing within autistic people and ADHD. A big cause, which is something that you guys wanted to know about, is said by Derek Sayer Andrews. He says differences in white matter development between individuals whose autism severity rose, remains the same, or decreased have a difference. And this is a graph showing each parts. And the white matter fibers in autistic people are what cause communication skills. And as you can see, they kind of go up and down, and it's very all over the place. Meanwhile, in somebody who has a non-autistic brain, theirs would be very stable. Now, the symptoms of ADHD can range between two types, the inattentive and the hyperactive. The inattentive type is loss of attention to detail, careless mistakes, hard time listening, a hard time following instruction, and losing track of time. The hyperactive part is what you commonly think of when you think of ADHD. It's the fidgeting, the unable to stop speaking, the interrupting, and these are all symptoms listed by Jonathan Posner. I also spoke with Emmett Acker about uncommon symptoms of ADHD, and he said that a big one that not many people know about is rejection sensitivity. For non-autistic people and people without ADHD, when we get told no, we react like, oh, okay. But people with these neurodevelopmental disorders, they react extremely strongly. If you tell them no, it will feel like they've been hit by a bus. And the symptoms of autism range because it is a spectrum. You can either be very low functioning, which a lot of people, that's their schema of autism, or it can be like Asperger's syndrome, where it's very high functioning, and most of the time you can't even really tell. But Emmett Acker says that he experiences social withdrawal, a loss of theory of mind, which is the ability to put yourself in others' shoes, and sensory issues. The treatments of ADHD are also written by Jonathan Posner, and he included both medical and non-medical. Medical would be like Adderall, which is a stimulant to help the inattentive side of ADHD, and Satura, which is a non-stimulant to help the hyperactive side of ADHD. Cognitive behavioral therapy also works for both types. And then Emmett Acker spoke to me about the treatments he has for autism. These are things like behavioral therapy. But he says that the thing that helps him the most is having supportive friends who listen to him ramble about his special interests. So to conclude, neurodivergent disorders affect 11.5 million people collectively, but they are still complex and hard to understand both in a professional setting and a personal setting. I hope that I challenge some of your guys' biases because you all have somebody in your life with a neurodevelopmental disorder, and that now you know how to help them best. Thanks for listening to my speech.